In the remote Appalachian Mountains, where every gust of wind could extinguish a flame, one mountaineer's secret fire pit endured the fiercest storms without so much as a flicker. But the tale behind this fire's unbreakable strength begins with more than survival. It's a story of ingenuity born from the ashes of loss. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you're fascinated by mountain survival and timeless ingenuity, hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's tale might just be even more legendary. The winter storm came swiftly, just as it always did in the Appalachian highlands, the wind howling like a living creature seeking a way inside. Elijah Harlan had built his cabin with sturdy logs, but that wouldn't be enough to protect him from the wild fury of the wind. For years he had survived in these harsh conditions, but there was one thing he had never truly mastered: the fire. The mountains were unforgiving, and a fire was the lifeblood of any cabin during the bitter months of December through February. But in a place where the weather could change in an instant, a fire was both a blessing and a danger. Elijah had learned this truth after losing his first home to a gust of wind that had snuffed out the hearth and left him in darkness. It was an experience that stayed with him, like the cold that lingered in his bones for weeks after the storm passed. But this time Elijah had a plan. He wasn't about to be caught unprepared again. He knew that in the mountains, survival meant thinking ahead, thinking differently. So, with the winds howling outside, he began work on a new fire pit design, something that would stand against even the fiercest gusts. It was a silent fire pit, built not with metal or stone, but with layers of clay, carefully designed to funnel the heat and protect the flame from the elements. Elijah spent days perfecting the pit, digging into the frozen earth and layering the walls with thick clay. He tested it, watching as the fire burned hotter and brighter in the protective shell he had crafted. The wind outside howled, but inside his cabin, the flame never wavered. It wasn't just the pit itself that was special. It was the way it allowed Elijah to keep the fire alive, not just through wood or kindling, but through an intuitive, almost magical design. The flame stayed sheltered, yet strong. The pit hummed with a quiet power, as if it had found a way to speak back to the storm. That first night, Elijah sat by the fire, mesmerized by its steady glow. Outside, the storm raged harder than ever, with gusts reaching up to 40 miles per hour. The old trees around the cabin creaked and moaned under the strain, but Elijah didn't flinch. The fire was his protection, his warmth, and his only companion in the bitter wilderness. As he sat in the dim glow, his mind wandered back to the years he had spent in the mountains, the lessons learned, and the mistakes made. He had seen the struggle of so many men who came before him, those who had been broken by the harsh elements or swept away in the storms of time, but Elijah wasn't like those men. He was different. He had something they didn't, a knowledge of the land, a deep understanding of the elements, and now a fire pit that could defy nature itself. He leaned forward, his hands gently warming near the flames. The fire pit had an almost hypnotic effect. There was a rhythm to it, a quiet song that seemed to carry him back to a time before the world had changed. A time when men relied not on machines or tools but on their wits and their hands. A time when survival depended on being in tune with the earth. Elijah had built the fire pit not out of necessity, but out of a desire to prove something, to prove that he could live in harmony with nature rather than be at its mercy. The fire flickered brightly in the stone pit, its flames licking at the air like a predator testing its prey. But the flame would not be extinguished, not by the wind, not by the cold. It would survive, as long as Elijah did. As the night wore on and the storm howled louder outside, Elijah allowed himself to relax, a rare gift in the mountains. The fire was steady, its heat wrapping around him like a protective shield. For the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of peace, a sense that he had finally mastered the wilderness. And with that mastery came a quiet satisfaction. He wasn't just surviving now, he was thriving. The storm outside was relentless, but inside the cabin, Elijah sat by the fire, watching the flames dance. He knew that the silent fire pit he had built would be his greatest legacy. A symbol of his ability to endure, to adapt, and most importantly, to outlast the wildness of the world around him. Weeks passed, and Elijah's cabin became a fortress against the harsh winter winds. The fire pit, though simple in appearance, had become his most valuable tool, not just for warmth but for survival. The days grew colder and the winds picked up, but the fire within his cabin never faltered. It burned with an intensity that seemed to mock the fury of the storm outside. As Elijah sat by the fire one evening, the wind howling like a wild beast, he felt a sense of pride swell in his chest. He had finally created something that had withstood the test of time, something that could keep him safe when everything else around him was breaking down. But the peace was fleeting, as Elijah knew that survival in these mountains wasn't guaranteed. Nature was a constant force, shifting unpredictably, and even the strongest shelters could be broken down by a single, well-timed gust of wind. Elijah couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that there was still more to learn. The fire pit was strong, yes, but could it withstand the fiercest of storms? The ones that came from the highest peaks, the storms that no one in these mountains had ever survived? As the days stretched into months, Elijah began to experiment. He studied his fire pit, studying how the flames behaved within its confines. He took note of every gust of wind, every shift in temperature, testing how the pit held up under different conditions. The fire seemed to respond, adapting, growing hotter when the cold winds blew and dimming when the air was still. One evening, during the height of a particularly vicious storm, Elijah made a critical discovery. As the wind howled outside, he watched closely as the fire began to flicker slightly. For a brief moment, he thought it might go out, but then something remarkable happened. The fire adjusted. The flames seemed to bend and shift, creating a more focused, intense heat that burned brighter than before. It was as though the fire, too, had learned to survive the elements. It was then that Elijah realized the true genius of his design. The pit wasn't just sheltering the flames from the wind, it was guiding the fire itself, allowing it to adapt to the changing conditions. He had unwittingly built something that wasn't just resistant to nature, it was in harmony with it. The fire pit had become an extension of his own survival instincts. It was a system, a living, breathing creation that reacted to the environment around it, keeping him alive in the harshest of conditions. Elijah sat back, watching the fire with renewed appreciation. He had created something far more than a simple hearth. He had built a tool that could survive anything the mountains threw at him. And in doing so, he had discovered something that no other mountaineer had known. The secret to surviving the wind was not fighting it, but working with it. The winter of 1838 was unlike any Elijah had ever seen. The storm clouds seemed to gather more quickly, the winds more fierce, the snow deeper. The mountains were holding their breath, waiting for something. Elijah knew the signs, and he could feel that a test was coming. A test that would push his fire pit to the limit. He had lived in the mountains long enough to understand the unpredictability of nature. It was only a matter of time before the perfect storm would arrive. As the days passed, Elijah continued his work around the cabin, always keeping the fire burning, always keeping watch. He had learned to rely on the fire pit more than any other tool. The blaze was the only constant in his life out here, a reminder that even in the darkest, most desolate times, there was warmth, there was hope. Then, one morning, the storm Elijah had been waiting for arrived. The winds howled through the valley like a pack of wolves, and the snow came down in sheets so thick it seemed to erase the world beyond his windows. The trees outside shook and bent under the force of the storm, their branches snapping with loud cracks. It was a storm unlike any other Elijah had faced, and he knew that this would be the real test not just for his fire pit, but for his own survival. He huddled close to the fire, watching the flames flicker and dance. The wind was so strong that the cabin walls groaned under its pressure. Elijah's eyes never left the fire, watching as the flames bent and flickered, but never went out. The fire pit was holding strong, but could it withstand the full force of the storm? The hours passed, and the storm showed no sign of relenting. Elijah knew that he had to trust his design, to trust that the fire pit would do its job. He had spent months perfecting it, testing it, learning its secrets. Now, it was time to see if the fire pit could do what it was made to do, survive the worst that nature could throw at it. As the storm raged outside, Elijah slowly let go of the fear that had gripped him for so long. He could feel the warmth of the fire, steady and constant, surrounding him like an invisible shield. He closed his eyes, leaning back against the rough-hewn logs of the cabin and allowing himself a rare moment of peace. The fire was still burning strong, the storm was still raging, but inside the cabin, Elijah had found something that few men in the mountains ever did: trust. The storm raged on through the night, but by morning it had passed. The sun shone weakly through the clearing clouds, and Elijah rose from his seat by the fire, moving to the window. He looked out at the trees, still bent by the weight of the wind, the snow piled high against the cabin walls. And in that moment, he knew the fire pit had passed the test. It had endured, and so had he. The wind had not taken his flame, it had not claimed his life. Elijah's trust in his creation had been well placed, and he knew that, no matter what came next, he had built something that would keep him safe. He had built a fire that could not be snuffed out. Elijah's cabin was quiet in the aftermath of the storm. The wind had blown through the mountains for days, but now it had receded, leaving only a deep silence. Snow had accumulated in thick drifts around the cabin, burying the world in white. The trees, battered and bent from the wind, stood still, their branches laden with frost. Inside, the fire pit continued to burn, its flames now gentle and steady after the tempest had passed. Elijah had seen the wild storms of the mountains before, but this one had been different. He had watched the world outside his window turn into a battlefield between nature's fury and the quiet strength of his fire. Yet, through it all, the silent fire pit had held firm. No gust of wind, no swirling snow, no bitter cold had managed to extinguish it. The fire had burned on, a beacon of defiance against the elements. Now, as the sun peeked through the clouds and cast long shadows on the snow-covered ground, Elijah felt a sense of accomplishment. The fire pit had proven itself. He had trusted his design, and it had held true. But even as he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride, he couldn't shake the thought that his work was not yet finished. He had built a fire that could survive storms, but could it survive the next winter, the next challenge? His mind wandered back to the fire pit's design. The walls of clay had been carefully layered, the pit itself carefully constructed to shield the flame from the harshest winds. He had learned the secrets of the mountain's weather, adapted them, and used those lessons to shape something that could survive when everything else failed. Yet, Elijah understood that nature was unpredictable. The mountains could change in an instant. Even the most carefully crafted systems could break down. That thought drove him back to his work. Though his fire pit had passed the test, Elijah could never stop improving. It was his nature to keep pushing forward, to never settle, to always be ready for the next challenge. As the evening drew near, he set to work, refining his creation. He spent hours in the dim light of the cabin, his hands rough and calloused from years of the tent labor. He scraped at the clay, adding layers where needed, smoothing the walls, and checking for any weaknesses. The fire continued to burn, as though it had become a living thing, silently watching Elijah's every move. And in that moment, Elijah knew that his survival was no longer just about building a fire that could withstand the storm. It was about creating something that could stand the test of time, something that would endure long after he was gone. The fire pit was no longer just a tool, it was a legacy, a silent testament to his ingenuity and determination. Winter settled into the Appalachian mountains like a heavy, uninvited guest, bringing with it a biting cold and deep, relentless snows. Yet, after the last storm, the skies had been eerily clear, the air crisp and still. The howling winds of past weeks seemed to have disappeared, leaving an unsettling quiet in their wake. Elijah couldn't remember the last time the wind had been so silent for so long. As the days stretched into weeks, the calm made him uneasy. In the mountains, stillness often meant something was brewing, a storm waiting to take shape. But the fire pit burned on, its flames steady and strong, never faltering, even as the temperature continued to drop. Elijah had come to rely on it more than anything else. It was the one constant in a world of change. The fire was his shield, his warmth, and his only comfort in the face of nature's unpredictable wrath. However, despite the quiet, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that the storm that had passed was just a prelude. The mountains always had another test to offer, and it was only a matter of time before it came. His fire pit had proven its worth in the last storm, but Elijah understood that no victory was permanent. The mountains would never stop testing him. The fire pit was not a guarantee of safety, but a tool, a vital one, in his ongoing struggle to survive. One evening, as he sat by the fire, Elijah stared into the dancing flames, his mind wandering. The fire, now a flickering beacon in the dark, seemed almost alive, as if it could sense the tension in the air. He thought of his ancestors who had survived these mountains before him, with little more than their wits and their hands. He thought of the many men who had come before him, those who had failed in their attempts to conquer the wild. The thought filled him with both pride and sadness. For all the ingenuity in the world, survival in these mountains came down to one simple truth: the wilderness didn't care about the tools you had. It cared only about your ability to endure. The fire's steady glow offered him some comfort, but he knew it was not the end of the struggle. It was merely a pause, a brief respite before the next test. And Elijah knew that whatever came next, he would be ready. He had learned how to survive the storm, how to make fire, how to outlast the elements. But what he had truly learned, over the course of many winters and countless storms, was this: survival was not about defying nature. It was about accepting it, understanding it, and adapting to it. And that, Elijah thought, was the true secret to living in the mountains. As the wind began to stir again, softly at first, Elijah stood and approached the fire. He bent low, watching the flames flicker in the dim light. The wind was picking up, but the fire was still strong, and that, for now, was enough. The early days of March brought a strange peace to the Appalachian mountains. The storms had ceased, and the wind had quieted, leaving a stillness that felt almost unnatural. Elijah had grown accustomed to the constant howling of the winter winds, the screeching gusts that tested his strength and resolve. Now, with the silence of the mountains surrounding him, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting, something that would test him in ways he hadn't prepared for. He had spent the past few months perfecting his fire pit design, reinforcing it with layers of clay and stone, fine-tuning every aspect of it to ensure it would withstand the harshest of winters. The pit had passed the test of the previous storms, and for that, Elijah had felt a rare sense of satisfaction. Yet, deep inside, a gnawing thought lingered. What if the storm wasn't the real threat? What if the quiet was the true danger? One evening, as Elijah sat by the fire, the crackling of wood his only companion, his thoughts drifted back to his early years in the mountains. He remembered the way the men in his town spoke of the dangers of these peaks, not just from nature's fury, but from the creatures that roamed the land, the wolves, the mountain lions, and even the bears. But the greatest threat, the one that haunted the shadows of every cabin, was the cold. Cold so deep, so penetrating, that it could freeze a man's bones before he even realized it. The fire pit had been his answer to the wind and the snow. But Elijah understood that fire alone wouldn't protect him from the cold. The chill that seeped into the bones was an insidious enemy, one that crept into the walls of the cabin, into the very air you breathed. He had seen it happen to men who had stayed too long in the wilderness, men who had let their guard down when the sun shone. He had learned that the real danger was not the storms you could see coming, but the cold that crept up behind you silently until it was too late. As the fire crackled, Elijah noticed something odd. The flames flickered in an erratic pattern, as though disturbed by something unseen. His eyes narrowed, watching the dance of the flames. Then, he heard it, a low, ominous sound, like the wind shifting in a strange way, bending unnaturally. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. For a moment, Elijah considered ignoring the sound, chalking it up to the wind or the settling of the cabin's walls. But something told him to listen. The wind had grown eerily still, and the air felt wrong, as though a storm was coming, but not the kind he was used to. His hand instinctively moved to the rifle that rested against the wall. The wind had shifted again, but this time it was no longer the howling gusts he knew. The stillness felt like something was watching him, waiting. It wasn't the storm that he feared now. It was the quiet, the unnatural pause before the real test. Elijah knew that the mountain always had a way of surprising you, And it was this silence that held the true danger. The next morning, Elijah woke to find the world outside his cabin blanketed in a soft layer of snow. The storm he had feared had arrived, but it wasn't the kind of storm he had expected. This was a quiet, insidious force, a storm of ice and cold that crept through the trees without a sound. The wind was gone, but the air was sharper, colder, more dangerous than it had ever been. Elijah stood at the window, his breath fogging up the glass as he watched the snow fall in, gentle flakes. There was no sound, no movement in the trees. It was as if the world itself had frozen in place. The fire in his pit burned steadily, its warmth filling the cabin, but Elijah knew that this was the calm before the storm, the true test of his fire's resilience. He moved away from the window, his boots crunching against the cold wood floor. The fire had been a constant companion for months now, a symbol of his endurance, his will to survive. But Elijah understood that the cold wasn't something you could just outlast. It wasn't a storm you could ride out. It was a force that would wear you down, bit by bit, until there was nothing left but the frozen earth. Elijah spent the morning tending to the fire, adding logs, carefully stoking the embers. He watched the flames flicker, their warmth pushing back against the growing chill in the cabin. But the cold was persistent, creeping through the walls, finding every small crack and crevice. It didn't care how carefully he had built his shelter. It didn't care how strong the fire was. By midday, the temperature inside the cabin had dropped noticeably. Elijah knew that he would have to act quickly if he wanted to survive this latest challenge. He had built the fire pit to withstand the wind and the storm, but now he had to test its ability to hold against the cold. It wasn't just about the flames anymore, it was about the way the heat radiated, how it filled the cabin with warmth and kept the frost from claiming his life. With every passing hour, the temperature outside continued to plummet. The cold was no longer just an annoyance. It was a killer, moving in on Elijah's cabin, silently creeping through the cracks, threatening to extinguish his fire and leave him to freeze. But Elijah was ready. He added another log to the fire, watching the flames surge higher, pushing the cold back. The cabin grew warmer, and the ice that had been creeping up the walls began to recede. For the first time in days, Elijah allowed himself a moment of peace. He had passed the test of the wind, and now he was passing the test of the cold. The fire had not failed him yet. As the snow continued to fall outside, Elijah sat back in his chair, watching the fire burn. The mountain had thrown everything it could at him, the storms, the cold, the endless tests, but he had endured. And as long as the fire burned, he would continue to endure. Spring was approaching, but winter's grip lingered in the Appalachian mountains. Elijah stood at the window of his cabin, watching the melting snow run in rivulets across the ground. The air was still, the usual howling winds absent, and the mountain silence felt heavier than ever. In the months since his fire pit had proven its resilience, the trials of nature seemed to have quieted, leaving Elijah in a state of uneasy peace. He had survived everything the wilderness had thrown at him, the brutal winds, the bone-chilling cold, the isolation. But now, in the calm that settled over the land, Elijah felt the pressure of an unspoken truth. Nature wasn't just about surviving the elements. The land itself had a way of testing you in ways you didn't expect. And silence could be just as dangerous as the fiercest storm. Days passed with little change. Elijah spent his time tending to the fire, fortifying the cabin, and preparing for the next season of trapping. But with the world outside so still, he couldn't escape the growing sense of unease. The fire pit, though a symbol of his survival, no longer brought him the comfort it once had. The quiet seemed to seep into his bones, filling the space where the storms used to rage. Alone in his cabin, Elijah felt the weight of isolation more acutely than ever. At night, the silence was deafening. The fire crackled softly, but the sounds of the outside world, the calls of birds, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush had disappeared. The absence of sound became a constant presence in Elijah's mind. He knew that the mountain had seasons of quiet, but this felt different. This stillness was heavy, as if the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. The fire pit, once his most reliable ally, now felt like a quiet reminder of what had been lost: the connection to the outside world, the companionship of the wild. Elijah stood up from his chair and walked to the door, his boots crunching on the frozen floor. Stepping outside, he took a deep breath of the crisp mountain air, but it didn't feel fresh. It felt stale, suffocating. There was no wind, no movement in the trees. Just the cold, quiet expanse of the wilderness stretching out before him. Elijah had always prided himself on his resilience, his ability to survive. But now, faced with the mountain's silence, he wondered if he had truly mastered the art of living in harmony with nature, or if he had merely learned to endure. The absence of the storm, the stillness of the plain air, felt more threatening than any snowstorm or gust of wind. The fire pit had protected him from the external forces of the wilderness, but it could not fill the void of solitude that weighed on his heart. As the days passed, Elijah retreated further into himself, his thoughts becoming darker, more introspective. He had faced the fury of the mountain and survived. But the silence, the quiet that seemed to surround him like a thick fog, was a force he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't something he could outrun, and it wasn't something his fire pit could defend against. By the time spring arrived, the snow had melted, and the mountain was beginning to thaw. The once frozen streams were running again, and the first green shoots of grass appeared along the trails. But the quiet that had taken hold of Elijah's soul still lingered. The fire pit, his symbol of resilience, still burned brightly in the heart of his cabin, but its flames no longer offered the comfort they once had. The winds had returned, but even the wind seemed muted now, almost like a whisper compared to the storms Elijah had survived. The sense of stillness had become a part of Elijah, woven into his daily life like the very air he breathed. At first, he had fought against it, trying to push through the silence with activity, with work. But the quiet had a way of creeping into his thoughts, filling the empty spaces until there was no more room for anything else. He could no longer pretend that survival was about the external forces of nature alone. Survival was also about what was happening inside, and Elijah had to confront the silence within himself. He spent more time outside as the days grew longer, walking through the woods, listening for the first signs of life. The birds returned, their songs breaking the silence that had so long oppressed him. The rustle of animals in the underbrush became a familiar sound once more, but the real change came when Elijah sat quietly by the fire one evening, his eyes closed, listening to the crackle of the flames. For the first time in months, he felt the weight of the silence lift, not because it was gone, but because he had come to accept it. Elijah had always been a man who survived through force, through strength, through action, but the mountain had taught him that survival was also about surrender, surrendering to the stillness, to the silence, and to the understanding that nature could not be conquered, only understood. He realized that the fire pit wasn't just a tool for warmth and protection, it was a symbol of balance. It wasn't just the force that kept the storms at bay, but the stillness it created that allowed Elijah to listen, to reflect, and to grow. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Elijah sat back in his chair, gazing into the fire. The mountain had tested him in ways he hadn't expected, but in the end, it had given him something more than survival. It had given him the ability to find peace in the silence. The fire still burned strong, its warmth filling the cabin, and Elijah knew that, no matter what the future held, he had learned the most important lesson of all. Resilience wasn't just about fighting against the storms. It was about finding peace, even in the quiet.